Chapter 26, The Verdict and a Hero's Surveillance, Part 1. The trial chamber was silent, save for the murmurs of the gathered crowd. The heavy stone walls of Brum'korath's justice halls seemed to close in, amplifying every word, every footstep. Goldar sat at the head of the long, polished table, his once commanding presence now diminished by shackles, a far cry from the imposing leader he had been. The long white beard that had once symbolized his strength now hung limp, his hands bound in chains, and his face, though calm, betrayed a flicker of tension. Across the table, the dwarven council, seated in their ceremonial armor, deliberated quietly. Their eyes, sharp and calculating, flicked between Goldar and the party. The tension was palpable, the weight of the moment pressing down on all present. It wasn't just Goldar's fate they were deciding. It was the fate of the entire cult of the Sent Ones, whose influence had seeped into every crevice of Brum'korath in the wake of the explosion and the kingdom's upheaval. Finally, the chief of the council, a dwarf with a face lined by decades of battle and wisdom, stood and addressed the room. His voice was firm, though his eyes were weary. "Goldar of the Sent Ones," he began, his voice resonating with authority, "we have reached our verdict. The evidence against you is significant. Your actions, both past and present, have caused the lands much turmoil. But in the light of the kingdom's own instability, we are prepared to offer you a chance, a parole, under the condition of strict supervision. You will remain within Brum'korath's borders, and your movements will be monitored closely. Should you breach this trust, the consequences will be dire." Goldar did not flinch. He met the council's gaze with a cold, unwavering stare, as though his role in this moment had been long determined. His parole, however begrudging, was a victory of sorts, a lifeline, though it was weighed down by the chains that bound him. The dwarven council turned their attention to the party. The room's gaze shifted, and Lucas felt a sudden weight on his shoulders, a pressure that squeezed tighter with every passing second. He could feel the scrutiny on him, on Mina, on Thomas. They had been drawn into the tumultuous storm that was Goldar's trial, and now their own fate would be decided in the same breath. Lucas glanced briefly at Mina. Her jaw was clenched, her eyes narrowed with a mix of suspicion and unease. Thomas, always the stoic one, sat with a determined calm, though Lucas could see the tension in his posture, the subtle flex of his fingers as he gripped the armrests of his seat. The chief of the council turned to face them now, his gaze softening, but only slightly. "As for you, the heroes of Brum'korath," he said, his tone tinged with both respect and reservation, "your actions have been complicated. The explosion in Kingston, though catastrophic, was not of your making. However, your connection to the cult of the Sent Ones and the events that followed cannot be ignored." Lucas winced at the mention of Kingston, the memory of the explosion flashing behind his eyes like a fleeting nightmare. He couldn't remember the details, the exact moment when the explosion had occurred, but the weight of guilt still pressed on him. The dread of that explosion, the fear of its consequences, haunted him, even though the dwarves had found no evidence of their involvement. "We have deliberated," the council chief continued, "and after careful consideration, we have decided to grant you conditional freedom. You will not be imprisoned. Instead, you will be allowed to remain within Brum'korath, but you will be under strict surveillance. You will not leave the city without the express permission of the council. Your actions will be monitored, your movements tracked." Mina's eyes flicked to Lucas, a momentary flash of something unreadable in her gaze. She had always been fiercely independent, unwilling to let anyone dictate her actions. Now, under the weight of surveillance, that independence felt more like a distant dream. Lucas, too, felt the sting of the decision. The cold words of conditional freedom resonated in his mind, a bitter reminder that their release came with a price. Their status as heroes of Brum'korath had been earned through battle and sacrifice, but it was now tainted by the chains of scrutiny. They were not truly free, not in any sense of the word. Thomas, ever the strategist, was the first to speak. "We understand the conditions, but we have our own terms," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We need assurances. We cannot remain under constant surveillance without it affecting our mission. We must be able to move freely within the city, and we must have access to the resources we need to continue our work." The council murmured among themselves, clearly contemplating Thomas's request. For a moment the room was silent, the weight of the decision pressing down on them all. Finally, the chief nodded, his expression stern but measured. "Your conditions will be met," he said. "But know this, the safety of Brum'korath comes first. You will be watched, and your every move will be recorded. We will tolerate no further disruptions." As the verdict was finalized, the party was ushered out of the chamber. The walls of the justice halls seemed to close in as they walked, their footsteps echoing in the silence that followed. It felt as though the weight of Brum'korath's uncertainty was now pressing down on them, each step toward the door a reminder of the fragile peace they had been granted. Outside, the bustling streets of Brum'korath stretched out before them. The city seemed unchanged, its stone buildings towering above them, but the air was thick with tension. The dwarves' decision, though offering freedom, was laced with the understanding that their every move would be watched. There was no room for error, no space for them to breathe without being observed. The new accommodations they had been assigned lay in the heart of the city, near the justice halls, a lavish set of apartments that reflected their newly elevated status. But for all the luxury they were offered, it was a gilded cage, a reminder that they were not truly free. The lavish surroundings would do little to ease the knot in Lucas's chest, the ever-present feeling of being trapped, of being watched. Mina spoke first, her voice quiet but tinged with frustration. "This is hardly what I'd call freedom." Lucas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's a start, I guess, but they won't stop watching us. Not until they know exactly what we're doing here." Thomas, ever pragmatic, gave a terse nod. "We'll make the best of it. We have no choice." He paused, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "But we need to keep our wits about us. This is far from over." The party stood in silence for a moment, each of them lost in their thoughts, the weight of the trial still hanging over them. Brum'korath had granted them freedom, but at what cost? They had won a small victory, but the true battle was only just beginning. As they made their way toward their new quarters, the distant sounds of the city's bustling streets seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the uneasy feeling that nothing in Brum'korath would ever be the same again. The party's new accommodations were nothing short of lavish, though they carried a weight that felt almost as heavy as the shackles Goldar had worn moments before. The moment they stepped into the apartments, Lucas felt an odd sense of disorientation. The marble floors gleamed in the dim light, the walls adorned with intricate tapestries depicting the ancient history of Brum'korath. The scent of fresh wood and exotic spices hung in the air, a stark contrast to the musty, cold dungeon cells they had been held in for days. Everything about the space screamed wealth and influence, yet there was an unmistakable tension beneath the surface. The grandeur was meant to placate them, to remind them that they were no longer prisoners. But it also held them captive in a way. The freedom they had been granted was fragile, their every move monitored, their status under constant surveillance. Mina stepped into the main room first, her eyes scanning the space with a mix of awe and skepticism. The furniture was lavish, the windows large enough to offer a breathtaking view of the city's skyline. Soaring towers of stone and steel, the bustling streets below a stark contrast to the serenity of their new, temporary home. The faint sound of the city's hum reached their ears, but it was muffled by the thick stone walls. For a moment it almost felt like a dream, an illusion of comfort in a world that had grown too complicated, too dangerous. "This is much better than a cell," Mina said, breaking the silence, her voice laced with uncertainty. "But it doesn't feel like home." Lucas nodded in agreement, though his gaze never lingered on the opulence around them. His mind was preoccupied with the parole they had been granted, with the knowledge that their every step would be watched. He could already feel the eyes of the dwarves, their suspicion and cautious respect weighing on him, even from within these walls. "Yeah, it's not what I expected," he murmured, his fingers lightly tracing the edge of a marble table. "But I guess it'll have to do for now." Thomas stepped forward, his towering presence seeming to fill the room. His eyes, always sharp and calculating, scanned the space with the precision of a soldier surveying a battlefield. "We'll have to stay sharp," he said, his voice calm but filled with the steady resolve they had all come to expect from him. "This isn't just a place of rest, it's a reminder of what's at stake." Before any of them could speak further, a soft knock echoed through the door, followed by the entrance of a dwarven servant. The young dwarf's face was polite, but his eyes flickered with the same wariness that seemed to define the city itself. He bowed slightly as he spoke. "Honored guests, there is a message from the Dwarven Council. A feast is being held tomorrow in your honor at the castle adjacent to the Justice Halls. You are invited to join us for the evening." The mention of a feast made Mina's stomach growl, a fleeting moment of normalcy in an otherwise strange situation. Lucas, however, felt his unease grow. The invitation was both an honor and a subtle reminder of their precarious position. The dwarves had extended their hospitality, but there was always the underlying tension between respect and distrust. They were heroes, yes, but also a potential threat, a reminder of the forces at play that even Brum'korath's mighty walls couldn't keep out. "Tomorrow, huh?" Mina's voice was thoughtful, her brow furrowing as she processed the information. "A feast? Seems like they're trying to be nice, but there's something off about it." "I agree," Lucas replied, his gaze moving toward the window, watching the city come alive in the early evening light. "We're not here by choice. This invitation might be more of a test than a celebration. They want to see how we react, what we say, how we handle ourselves." Thomas gave a grim nod. "Dwarven politics," he muttered. "A little gift wrapped in a lot of scrutiny. We should go, of course. But we need to remember that we're still being watched." The servant seemed eager to leave, perhaps sensing the shift in the room's mood. He bowed again and stepped back toward the door. "The feast will be in the evening," he added quickly. "Expect to be treated as honored guests. The city's finest will be in attendance." As he left, closing the door behind him, the party stood in quiet contemplation. The promise of a feast, of luxury and indulgence, seemed almost out of place in the midst of everything else they had endured. The world had shifted under their feet so quickly, and Brum'korath's sudden generosity felt like another puzzle piece they couldn't quite fit. "We should make an appearance," Thomas said finally, his voice steady but filled with the weight of responsibility. "The dwarves are testing us, but it could work in our favor. A little diplomacy goes a long way." "I'm not so sure it'll be that simple," Lucas replied, his mind already racing through the implications of attending such an event. "We'll be the center of attention, for better or worse, and the last time we drew this kind of attention, things didn't go so well." Mina, always the optimist, shrugged lightly. "We don't have much choice. If we turn it down, it'll only make things worse, and it might give us a chance to learn something important. It's not all bad." Lucas sighed, rubbing his temples. He didn't want to admit it, but she was right. They needed allies, or at least the appearance of allies. Brum'korath might be watching them, but they could use the opportunity to keep their enemies at bay. For now. The next day came far too quickly. The feast loomed ahead like a shadow, its promises of food, drink, and celebration far outweighed by the weight of the situation. As they made their way through the streets to the castle, it was impossible to ignore the eyes that followed them. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some waved and cheered, calling out to the party as if they were legends in the making. Others stood back, cautious, perhaps even fearful. The disciples' incident was still fresh in the minds of many, and the party's role in it made them both heroes and outcasts in the eyes of the public. "Look at them," Mina whispered as they passed a group of dwarves on the street, their faces a mixture of awe and apprehension. "We've become symbols of something. Bigger than ourselves." Lucas glanced at the faces in the crowd. Some nodded in respect, others whispered to each other, their eyes darting away when they saw the party looking back. A few boos filtered in from the edges, voices hesitant and unsure, but they were drowned out by the louder shouts of praise. The mixture of acclaim and suspicion was unsettling, and it was clear that they weren't universally loved. But for the moment, it was enough. They were alive. They had survived. When they reached the castle, they were led inside with the kind of fanfare that felt almost too extravagant. The Dwarven Hall was a towering, gilded structure, its high arches and stone pillars casting shadows over the guests that filled the room. The long tables groaned under the weight of platters of meats, fruits, and sweetmeats, while dwarves in their finest attire laughed and talked, a festive atmosphere alive in the air. But even amidst the celebration, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every smile felt a little too forced, every gesture a little too calculated. They were the guests of honor, yes, but they were also the ones being watched. Every word, every glance, was being measured. "Welcome," a deep voice boomed from across the room, and Lucas turned to see a prominent dwarf approaching. His robes were adorned with gold embroidery, and his beard, long and well-kept, seemed to shimmer in the firelight. The dwarf's face was stern, though his eyes gleamed with a hint of amusement. To the heroes of Brum'korath, the saviors of the city, and the potential threats to its future. He extended a hand, and the party, though cautious, accepted his greeting. As they exchanged pleasantries, Lucas couldn't help but notice the quiet tension hanging in the air, like a veil between them and the others. The feast was both a celebration and a subtle interrogation, and he couldn't help but wonder, what did they want from him? From them? The feast was grand, the dwarven halls resplendent with glimmering tapestries and massive hearths that cast flickering shadows across the stone walls. The air was thick with the aroma of roasted meats, freshly baked bread, and the earthy scent of ale. Yet, despite the festive atmosphere, the party could not shake the undercurrent of unease that ran through them. The laughter of the dwarves around them seemed distant, as if coming from another world entirely, one where they were not embroiled in the uncertainty of their place in Brum'korath. They were heroes, yes, but they were also prisoners under the watchful eyes of the city's most powerful figures. They had been granted temporary freedom, but every step they took felt like it could bring them closer to the very chains they had so recently escaped. As they settled into the long table, the weight of the situation bore down on them with every passing moment. Mina, sitting beside Lucas, was unusually quiet, her usual warm smile replaced by a tense frown. Her green eyes darted around the room, scanning the faces of the guests. She had always been quick to sense things others might miss, an instinct that had saved them all more times than she could count. But now, that instinct was on edge, and Lucas could feel it too. It was as though the whole room was a chessboard, with everyone watching for their next move. "What do you think they really want from us?" Mina whispered, her voice barely audible amidst the chatter of the feast. Her fingers curled around her goblet, but her grip was tight, almost too tight, as if she was preparing to spring into action at any given moment. Lucas leaned closer, lowering his voice as he scanned the room. "I'm not sure. It's all a show, I think. They want us to feel like honored guests, but we're still under surveillance. I can feel it. Every eye in this room is on us. We're not here because they like us. They want to see how we behave, how we react to all of this." Thomas, sitting across from them, was unusually silent. His eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. His fingers drummed absently against the side of his goblet, the clinking sound a stark contrast to the jovial music and laughter around them. He seemed unaffected by the grandeur of the feast, as though he could see through the facade of luxury to the deeper game being played. "We're pawns in their little game," he said after a long pause, his voice low and grim. "They want us to be grateful, to feel indebted to them for this luxury. But it's all part of the plan, a subtle way to control us." Lucas nodded, his own doubts growing. He could feel the heat from the flickering flames on the far end of the hall, but it did little to ease the cold knot forming in his stomach. The entire night felt like a performance. The dwarves' smiles were too perfect, their gestures too rehearsed. Even the laughter felt hollow, as if it were meant to cover up the unsaid words, the hidden thoughts behind every greeting. Mina, who had been watching the other guests with a quiet intensity, leaned back slightly in her chair. "I don't like it," she muttered, her voice tight. "The whole thing feels like we're being paraded around. They want to see what we'll do, see how we'll react, and I'm not sure I trust them." Lucas could sense the tension in her words, the unease that was slowly bubbling to the surface. She had always been the one to keep the group grounded, to offer hope when things seemed darkest. But now that same strength seemed frayed, her instincts sharp but filled with suspicion. She was still the same Mina he had known, the fierce protector, but the weight of their situation was beginning to take its toll. "I don't think we can afford to trust anyone here," Lucas said quietly, his voice barely more than a breath. He could feel his own doubts gnawing at him, the uncertainty clouding his thoughts. "But we can't just walk away. We need their support. The war, the prophecy, everything is coming to a head. If we want to survive this, we need to play their game. At least for now." Across the table, Thomas met his gaze, his expression unreadable. His eyes were sharp, calculating, but there was something else there too, something Lucas couldn't quite place. It was the same look he had seen on his friend's face when they faced impossible odds in battle, when Thomas had been forced to make choices that had haunted him ever since. It was the look of someone who had seen too much, who had been forced to make impossible decisions, and had learned to live with the consequences. "We don't have a choice," Thomas said after a long silence. "We play their game, we play it well, and we use it to our advantage. But we don't forget who they are or why they've invited us here. They may think they're in control, but so long as we stay sharp, so long as we hold on to what we've learned, we can turn the tide." Lucas didn't respond right away, his thoughts drifting to the larger picture. The cult of the Sent Ones, Goldar's plans, the coming war, and the prophecy that seemed to tie them all together. His mind swirled with the weight of it all, the responsibility pressing down on him, a burden he wasn't sure he could bear, and yet he had no choice. The path ahead was set, and he had to walk it, no matter how much it terrified him. Mina's voice broke through his thoughts, softer this time, filled with a quiet sadness. "Do you ever wonder if we're just pawns too? That maybe this whole thing, this prophecy, the war, everything, it's all out of our hands?" Lucas turned to look at her, his heart heavy. He could feel the uncertainty in her words, the doubts that mirrored his own. They had been used before, manipulated by forces beyond their understanding. Goldar, the cult of the Sent Ones, the Empire. All of them had their own agendas. And in the midst of it all, they had to find their own way, to carve out their own path, even if it led them into danger. "I don't know," Lucas admitted, his voice low. "I've been asking myself the same thing. But if we are pawns, maybe we can at least choose how we move. We might not control everything, but we can control what we do next." Mina nodded slowly, her eyes still distant, as if she were lost in her own thoughts. She had always been the one to remind him that hope was worth fighting for, even in the darkest moments. But tonight, the weight of the situation seemed to have stolen some of that light from her. She was still strong, still determined, but the cracks were starting to show. The meal continued, the plates of food never seeming to empty, the conversations around them a constant hum. But the party's minds were elsewhere, consumed by the growing unease that settled over them like a heavy fog. Every toast, every cheer, felt like a challenge. The dwarves were testing them, watching their every move, and no one seemed to be able to escape the feeling that their role in this game was still being decided. As the night wore on, the cracks in their facade became more apparent. Thomas grew more restless, his gaze flickering to the shadows of the room as though expecting something to jump out at him. Mina was quieter than usual, her sharp intuition at war with the uncertainty she felt deep in her gut. And Lucas, ever the strategist, could see the pieces of their fate moving, but he didn't know how to stop them from falling into place. By the time the feast began to wind down, it was clear that the dwarves' hospitality was not enough to quell the storm brewing within them. The party had put on their masks, pretending to enjoy the festivities, but each of them carried their own doubts, their own fears about what the future held. They were still prisoners, still caught in a web of politics and prophecy, and no amount of food or drink could change that. As they stood to leave, Lucas could feel the weight of the moment, the weight of the choices ahead of them. They had to keep moving, had to stay sharp, because the game was far from over, and they still had a long way to go.